The rain over Springfield Armory was thin and metallic that March morning of 1936, hissing softly as it touched the barrels of rifles lined up like soldiers waiting for judgment. Inside a dim testing range, the air stank of oil, brass, and faint ozone from the sparks of distant machinery. A handful of U.S. Army officers, dressed in khaki and skepticism, watched a quiet Canadian-born gunsmith named John Garand set his strange-looking semi-automatic rifle onto the bench. It didn't look like much, too bulky, some said, too complicated, too newfangled for the traditions of an army still married to bolt-action simplicity. One colonel scoffed to another. "The damn thing cycles itself? Sounds like magic or madness." Someone laughed. "The boys will jam it in the mud by lunch." Garand didn't respond. He rarely did. His hands were steady, deliberate. He had spent years, nearly 2 decades, refining the idea that a rifle could fire with the pull of a single trigger, reload itself, and be ready again before the enemy's bolt was even halfway lifted. It wasn't just about firepower. It was about survival, speed that saved lives when fractions of a second meant everything. Still, the room was heavy with disbelief. For generations, soldiers had been trained to trust the sharp crack of the Springfield 1903, a weapon that demanded rhythm, muscle, and patience. They had been told that more moving parts meant more failure, that innovation in war was a luxury, that a man's courage mattered more than his mechanism. The first test shot rang out, sharp, controlled, perfectly balanced. Then another, and another. The rifle barked rhythmically, almost musical in its precision. The recoil was smooth, the bolt's motion mechanical poetry. Brass casings danced across the concrete floor, tinkling like coins spilling from a slot machine. The officers leaned forward, squinting through the haze. One muttered, "It's running itself?" Garand pulled the trigger until the rifle gave a loud, metallic ping as the empty clip sprang out and clattered to the ground. A sound that would one day echo across continents. He looked up silently. No words, just the machine's performance speaking for him. Still, the skepticism held. Old habits in military minds die slower than soldiers on the front. Bureaucrats wrote notes, murmured about cost, complexity, maintenance in field conditions. They said it would never stand up to real mud, real grit, real war. The Army Ordnance Board, however, saw something different that day, a glimpse of the future. They recommended adoption. In 1936, the M1 Garand became the standard service rifle of the United States military, the first semi-automatic rifle ever to be issued in mass to infantry anywhere in the world. But no one then could imagine just how much that decision would reshape the battlefield. Across the Atlantic, in Europe and Asia, the world was trembling toward war. In Berlin, officers still trained with the Karabiner 98K. A fine weapon, accurate, reliable, but still a bolt-action design that forced a soldier to lift, pull, and slam the bolt after each shot. In Tokyo, the Japanese Army's Arisaka rifles echoed the same pattern. Tradition over technology. Discipline over speed. They didn't believe the Americans would ever field a rifle that could fire 8 shots as fast as a man could aim. Automatic rifles are heavy and waste ammunition, a German engineer once said dismissively when news of Garand's design trickled overseas. The Americans will drown in their own bullets. They didn't know yet that this arrogance would cost them thousands of men. But back home, the irony was still alive. Many in Congress mocked the idea that America needed millions of expensive new rifles. Isolationist sentiment ran deep. "Who are we going to fight?" asked one senator. "Canada?" Garand kept refining, testing, and perfecting his creation in silence, while politics raged around him. Even within the ranks, some soldiers resisted change. A Marine sergeant reportedly grumbled during early trials, "Give me my Springfield. I trust it more than this self-loader contraption." But within months of field testing, minds began to shift. The Garand didn't jam. It didn't choke on mud or dust the way they'd feared. It fired clean, it fired fast, and it hit hard. Soldiers who learned to use it realized they could put twice, sometimes 3 times as much lead on target compared to any enemy bolt-action rifleman. And yet, as the rifle proved itself, John Garand still walked the factory floors of Springfield like a man haunted by ghosts. He knew war was coming. He'd seen the headlines: Hitler in Poland, France falling, Japan's rise in the Pacific. Every improvement he made to the M1 meant that one day, young Americans would hold it in their hands not in tests, but in trenches, jungles, and ruined cities. There was pride in that, but also weight. He never patented the rifle, never profited from it personally. He called it a tool for soldiers, not a fortune for myself. By 1941, the storm finally broke. Pearl Harbor burned, and America, shocked and furious, hurled itself into global war. The M1 Garand followed the first waves of troops across the Pacific and the beaches of North Africa. Reports began to filter back. The rifle was performing beyond expectation. One private from the 1st Infantry Division wrote home, "When you squeeze it, it sings. The Krauts can't get their heads up fast enough." Another letter from Guadalcanal read, "The Japs have to work that bolt. We don't. That's why we're still standing." These words spread like legend, igniting morale across units. The M1 wasn't just a weapon, it was confidence made of steel and walnut. Still, its reputation wasn't yet fully formed. The Axis powers dismissed these letters as propaganda. In Berlin, generals boasted that their men could outshoot the trigger-happy Americans. In Tokyo, they laughed at the noisy Yankee rifle. They didn't know what was coming. They didn't know that soon, the very sound of that distinctive ping, the moment when a soldier's clip ejected, would strike both recognition and dread into the hearts of men on every front. The same sound that rang softly in that rain-soaked armory in 1936 would echo across Normandy, Bastogne, and Iwo Jima. The very sound of American industrial might meeting fascist hubris head-on. It began as an idea mocked by men in pressed uniforms. A self-loading rifle too clever for its own good. A weapon some said was too heavy, too fast, too unorthodox. But behind it stood not arrogance, but quiet resolve. A belief that progress, even in war, could save lives. The irony was brutal and beautiful. The rifle they laughed at would soon define the thunder of American firepower. It would become a symbol of the ordinary soldier's strength multiplied by innovation. The weapon that allowed one man to fight like three. That morning at Springfield Armory, as the officers packed up their papers and Garand wiped oil from his hands, the rain finally stopped. The sky opened to a pale winter sun, glinting off the rifle's polished receiver. Somewhere deep inside, Garand might have known that history had just changed, though no one around him did. To them, it was just another test, another day. But that unassuming moment marked the birth of a legend that would soon roar across continents, carried by 5 million hands into the storm of the century. And when the last shell hit the floor, when the last echo faded into the steel rafters, no one could have guessed that this unassuming machine would become the heartbeat of American victory. They said it would jam. It didn't. They said it would waste ammo. It saved lives. They said it wouldn't change war. It changed everything. By the late 1930s, the M1 Garand's design was approved, but its destiny still hung by a thread. The concept of a self-loading rifle in the hands of ordinary infantrymen was revolutionary, and revolutions rarely move smoothly. The first mass-production models from Springfield Armory began rolling out in cautious numbers, and what should have been a triumph for John Garand quickly turned into a storm of criticism and technical frustration. Soldiers complained that the early rifles sometimes ejected clips too forcefully, occasionally striking the shooter in the face. Others noted a peculiar issue. The rifle could slam fire, discharging unintentionally if not handled carefully. "It's too sensitive," some said. "A rifle shouldn't think for itself." Springfield's factory floor hummed day and night, filled with the scent of machine oil and the rhythmic thrum of stamping presses. America wasn't yet at war, but the army was preparing for the storm that everyone sensed was coming. Garand walked the aisles among hundreds of machinists, studying the assembly process, tweaking tolerances by thousandths of an inch. He wasn't a man of titles or ego, he was a perfectionist to a fault. When inspectors demanded higher output, he pushed back. "You can't rush precision," he warned. But the army wanted numbers. They needed rifles, and they needed them fast. In the meantime, rival inventors and critics circled like vultures. Some officers in the Ordnance Department favored other semi-automatic designs, like the Johnson rifle, which used a rotary magazine and had smoother recoil. Gun magazines of the time ran heated comparisons, questioning whether Garand's design was truly superior or merely lucky to have Army backing. The Johnson could be reloaded at any time. The Garand's en-bloc clip system required all 8 rounds to be fired before reloading. That ping sound, so distinctive and soon to be legendary, was mocked in early reviews. "It sings when it's empty," one critic wrote, "a sound that will get men killed." These voices echoed in congressional hearings where budgets were debated. Could America afford a weapon so complex when bolt-action rifles cost a fraction of the price? But history has a way of choosing its champions not through comfort, but through fire. The first tests in field conditions changed the tone. In the red clay training grounds of Fort Benning, soldiers ran live drills with the new M1s. They slogged through mud, fired in the rain, dropped the rifles into sand, and pounded them against tree trunks. The weapon refused to quit. It fired through grime and grit, its gas-operated system cycling with mechanical certainty. While bolt-action rifles jammed under dust or cold, the Garand kept spitting fire. "She don't like to stop," one private told his instructor, grinning. For the first time, the old skepticism began to erode under the weight of real performance. Yet even as its reputation slowly grew, the clouds of bureaucracy nearly killed it again. In 1940, a massive redesign of ammunition standards across the U.S. Army caused chaos. The newly standardized M2 ball cartridge used a slightly different pressure load than the original M1 ball ammunition for which Garand had tuned his rifle. The change, pushed through by logistics officers who cared more about paper efficiency than physics, began to cause bent operating rods and excess wear. Rumors spread fast. "The Garand's breaking down," soldiers complained. "The bolts crack. The rods bend." Critics pounced again. Some called for production to halt entirely and return to the old Springfield 1903. Garand himself fought this battle quietly but fiercely. He personally examined rifles from the field, taking notes in pencil on worn paper pads. He met with ammunition engineers, recalibrated gas ports, redesigned springs, and refused to let the rifle die by bureaucratic ignorance. "You don't throw away the future because of the wrong bullet," he said to one colonel during a tense meeting. Weeks later, he had adjusted the design to handle both ammunition types reliably. That small but vital modification would save countless rifles and lives in the years to come. Meanwhile, global tension was boiling over. Hitler had rolled into Poland, France had fallen, and the British Army was fighting for survival on the beaches of Dunkirk. America watched from across the Atlantic, half fearful, half defiant. Factories like Springfield and Winchester buzzed with anticipation. The production lines were expanding, the machines were retooled, and Garand's blueprints were being copied, refined, and multiplied. In 1941, just before Pearl Harbor, the Army ordered nearly 1 million rifles. A staggering figure that transformed Springfield Armory into one of the beating hearts of America's industrial war machine. But production came with its own nightmares. The tolerances on the M1 were incredibly tight, and even minor defects could cause catastrophic malfunctions. Workers had to be trained from scratch, many of them young women and men who had never handled precision machinery before. Mistakes happened. Entire batches of rifles failed inspection. Yet instead of collapsing, Springfield's workforce rallied. Garand himself would walk the assembly line, stopping to teach machinists how to polish a chamber or test an extractor spring. He was no longer just an inventor, he had become a symbol of persistence. The workers began calling him Mr. Garand, a sign of both respect and affection. His quiet, meticulous nature earned loyalty, and soon quality soared. When the attack on Pearl Harbor shattered America's illusion of distance, everything changed overnight. The War Department declared full mobilization. The factories went into overdrive. Men who once scoffed at the rifle now begged to carry it. The Springfield Armory's production exploded. Rifles were boxed, shipped, and rushed to every corner of the globe. By early 1942, M1 Garands were in the hands of soldiers landing in North Africa, fighting their first desperate battles against Rommel's Afrika Korps. And that's where the revelation came. In the Tunisian desert, U.S. troops found themselves trading fire with German infantry armed with the Kar-98K. The difference was night and day. While German soldiers worked their bolts, the Americans fired continuously. 8 shots before reload versus 1. Whole squads advanced under a steady wall of suppressive fire, forcing the enemy to keep their heads down. Reports flooded back to Washington. The M1 Garand gives us a rate of fire unmatched by any infantry in the world. Eisenhower himself later called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. That phrase would echo through history, forever tied to this rifle and its humble creator. But the struggle wasn't just mechanical, it was human. Garand worked himself to exhaustion, rarely leaving the armory, skipping meals, sleeping in his office. He suffered from headaches and back pain but refused to rest. Every improvement, every tolerance adjustment, was a personal war against failure. When one of his engineers urged him to take a break, Garand simply replied, "Men will depend on this. Rest can wait." Still, doubt lingered. War had a way of testing everything to the breaking point. Would the rifle truly hold up under the chaos of global conflict? Could the machinery of American industry match the demands of total war? No one yet knew the answer. The U.S. Army had pinned its faith on one man's design, a gas-operated semi-automatic rifle unlike anything else in the field. In those tense early months of 1942, as freighters crossed the Atlantic under threat of U-boats and young recruits trained in dusty camps with their new weapons, one question hung in the air. Would the M1 Garand live up to its promise, or collapse under the weight of its own legend before the real war had even begun? It began in the deserts of North Africa, where the first test of America's new rifle met the veterans of Hitler's Wehrmacht. The Germans had seen everything: lightning war across Europe, the best Mauser rifles in the world, and discipline honed through years of conquest. But what they hadn't seen was an entire enemy platoon armed with semi-automatic rifles capable of firing 8 rounds as fast as a man could aim. At Kasserine Pass in early 1943, American troops still stumbled tactically, but the weapon in their hands was a thunder they were learning to control. Reports from German officers described a volume of fire unusually high for infantry. In dusty skirmishes, GIs crouched behind dunes and walls, their M1 Garands cracking like metronomes of destruction. 8 sharp barks, a metallic ping, and a swift reload before the enemy could work his bolt. For the first time, the tables were turning. The rifle that had been doubted, mocked, and bureaucratically strangled was now reshaping the rhythm of battle itself. The bolt-action Kar-98K, once the symbol of German reliability, suddenly felt like an antique relic in the face of an army that could fire continuously without breaking stride. "When they come, they don't stop shooting," wrote one captured German corporal in his diary. "Their rifles never rest." The M1 wasn't perfect. It was heavy, it required care, but it made every American rifleman a storm unto himself. Fire superiority had a new definition. In Sicily, as the U.S. 7th Army fought through sunburned hills and stone villages, the M1 Garand came into its own. Squads learned to leapfrog fire, one line laying down constant semi-automatic volleys while the other advanced. German MG-42 teams, once feared for their rate of fire, found themselves countered by dozens of M1s pouring rounds in return. "We could feel it," one veteran recalled decades later. The rifle wasn't just faster. It was confidence in your hands. The sound of synchronized fire became the signature of American advances, like rolling thunder before a storm. Then came Italy. The mud, the mountains, the endless rain. Conditions that had once doomed rifles in the trenches of World War I now tested the M1 to its limit. And yet, the gas-operated mechanism that Garand had obsessed over kept performing. Soldiers dragged them through the muck, dropped them into foxholes filled with water, wiped them on their sleeves, and kept firing. "It works even when nothing else does," one corporal wrote home from Anzio. It was the kind of reliability that turned disbelief into devotion. Meanwhile, word was spreading fast. Across the Pacific, in the humid jungles of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan, Marines were writing their own chapter of the Garand's legend. The Japanese Imperial Army, known for ferocity and close-quarter charges, found itself outgunned. Where the Arisaka rifles required a pause between every shot, the M1 made the battlefield sing with near-continuous fire. Marines pinned down by banzai attacks could empty clip after clip, mowing down charging soldiers before they closed the distance. You could stop a rush before it started. One Marine sergeant remembered. You didn't pray for your reload. You prayed your clip held just a little longer. By 1944, the rifle had become an extension of the American soldier's soul. 5 million Garands were in production, filling armories, ships, and the hands of men who would soon storm Europe's fortress. At Normandy, as the gray dawn of June 6 broke over the English Channel, the M1 Garand went ashore strapped to thousands of backs. Wet, cold, and coated in sand, they came alive the moment boots hit the beaches. The roar of the surf mixed with the bark of M1 fire as soldiers took cover behind hedgehogs and corpses, firing at flashes from the cliffs. Every man with a Garand was a machine gun, a German survivor of Omaha Beach later said. We could not lift our heads. The rifle's precision, its relentless rhythm, turned every foxhole into a miniature fortress. As the Allies pushed inland through the hedgerows of France, the rifle's dominance only grew. The Garand's 8-round clip, mocked for its simplicity, became a deadly asset in close combat. German snipers soon learned to dread the distinctive ping, the sound that meant a nearby American was reloading, but also that another was already covering him. Units began staggering their reloads deliberately, ensuring no pause in fire. The rifle's semi-automatic action created a storm of suppression fire that overwhelmed defenders long before they could return accurate shots. At Bastogne, amid snow and blood and freezing misery, soldiers of the 101st Airborne dug in with their M1s during the Battle of the Bulge. They were surrounded, outnumbered, but armed with faith in their steel companions. Frostbite gnawed at their fingers, but the Garand still cycled faithfully. When the Germans demanded surrender, General McAuliffe's famous reply, "Nuts," was backed not just by American defiance, but by those rifles bristling from foxholes under white sheets of snow. Each shot cracked like punctuation in that single-word answer. The Germans couldn't understand how the Americans could fire so fast, so accurately, so endlessly. Propaganda officers insisted the U.S. had secretly armed its soldiers with automatic weapons. Rumors spread that each man carried 2 rifles. They didn't believe one gun could deliver such relentless punishment. But every battlefield proved otherwise. In field after field, the M1 Garand turned the tide, not through magic, but through simple, unstoppable engineering. And it wasn't just the battlefield. It was the factory floors in Massachusetts and Illinois, where men and women, many of them young, working long shifts under wartime quotas, kept the rifles flowing by the thousands each week. Each one was tested, inspected, stamped, and shipped. The ping of freedom, they called it in wartime posters. John Garand himself rarely left Springfield. As soldiers fought with his creation across 2 oceans, he remained in the background, pale and exhausted, but proud. He often read letters from the front. Stories of the rifle saving entire squads, accounts of men who survived ambushes because their rifle didn't jam. "Your gun saved my life, Mr. Garand," one soldier wrote. "It fired when nothing else did." By 1945, the myth had become truth. The M1 Garand wasn't just a rifle. It was the mechanical embodiment of America's industrial soul. It had fought on every front, in every climate, against every kind of enemy, and never yielded. When Germany finally crumbled and Japan burned under firestorms, the M1 stood in victory photos, gleaming in the hands of grinning, dirt-covered soldiers. It was there at the liberation of Paris, in the rubble of Berlin, and under the rising sun of Tokyo Bay as the war ended. Even America's enemies acknowledged its power. After the war, captured German engineers examined the M1 with grudging admiration. "It is the finest rifle of its kind," one concluded. No army was better equipped in infantry arms. Soviet observers, too, studied it closely, taking notes that would influence the SKS and later the AK-47. The M1 Garand had set a new standard for infantry weapons, simple enough to mass-produce, reliable enough to survive hell, and fast enough to dominate the modern battlefield. When General George S. Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. It wasn't flattery. It was recognition. This was the tool that had allowed ordinary men, farm boys, mechanics, students, to stand toe-to-toe with the most disciplined armies in history and win. It had turned infantry into a force of relentless precision and courage. Its roar was the sound of democracy fighting for its life and winning. By war's end, more than 5 million M1 Garands had been produced. 5 million voices of thunder. 5 million testaments to one man's stubborn vision. Across continents, veterans who had carried it home hung it on walls, passed it to their sons, or kept it in closets like sacred relics. They remembered its weight, its balance, its metallic ping that had once meant both danger and deliverance. And though the war was over, that sound, the sound that began in Springfield Armory under skeptical eyes, still echoed in the memory of every man who had pulled its trigger. What began as ridicule had become reverence. What began as a madman's design had rewritten the language of war. The M1 Garand was no longer just a weapon, it was history carved in walnut and steel. And on every front where its voice had spoken, the world had listened. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world exhaled, but the echoes of the M1 Garand still lingered across continents. On battlefields from Tunisia to Tokyo, the weapon that had once been doubted, mocked, and resisted had become inseparable from the very image of American victory. Soldiers returning home brought with them memories not only of terror and comradeship but of the rifle that had stood by them through it all. Many said it was more than a tool, it was a partner, a lifeline, a piece of home forged from steel and purpose. "She never quit on me," one veteran told a reporter as he disembarked at New York Harbor. "And because she didn't, I came home." But victory brought with it an irony so profound that even John Garand himself could hardly process it. The weapon that had defined America's industrial might, that had been called the greatest battle implement ever devised, was now surplus. The same factories that had produced millions of them in feverish wartime rhythm now fell quiet, their forges cooling, their workers sent home. Springfield Armory, once the heart of the nation's arsenal, became a place of nostalgia rather than urgency. Crates of Garands lined warehouses, marked for peacetime storage or foreign aid. The thunder of war had become the silence of victory. And yet, the story didn't end. In Korea, only 5 years later, that silence was shattered once again. The winter of 1950 turned the Korean peninsula into a frozen graveyard, and the M1 Garand came roaring back into relevance. Against waves of Chinese and North Korean troops armed largely with bolt-action Mosinagants, American and UN soldiers held the line, their M1s firing relentlessly into the darkness. Veterans of World War II who had re-enlisted found themselves cradling familiar weapons, their hands remembering every weight, every motion, every click of that en-bloc clip. "You could tell who was firing an M1, recalled a Marine at Chosin Reservoir. "It had a rhythm, a song. You knew that sound meant someone was still fighting." Reports from Korea once again confirmed what the world had already learned. The M1 Garand wasn't just reliable, it was timeless. Even in the freezing cold, when lubricants thickened and other weapons jammed, the Garand kept cycling. In the chaos of retreat and counterattack, it became an anchor of stability. Soldiers cleaned them under blankets, thawed them by campfires, and trusted them completely. That kind of trust is rare between man and machine, but the M1 had earned it with every round it had fired through mud, snow, and smoke. Back home, John Garand continued his quiet work. He never became rich, never sought fame. When Congress later tried to grant him a financial award for his service, he declined the fortune, accepting only modest recognition. "I built it for soldiers, not for profit," he said simply. His colleagues remembered him as a man who spoke softly, moved deliberately, and never once boasted of the weapon that had helped save civilization. He retired in 1953, a legend in the corridors of Springfield, yet largely unknown to the public. The irony was almost poetic. The man who gave the American soldier his strongest voice was himself nearly voiceless in history. As the decades passed, new rifles emerged. The M14 replaced the M1, borrowing its soul but adding select fire capability and a detachable magazine. Then came the M16, lightweight and modern, a rifle of a new era and new wars. But for every generation that followed, the old Garand refused to fade into obscurity. It remained in the arsenals of allies around the world: France, Italy, Greece, South Korea, the Philippines. In some countries, it fought again even into the 1970s, clutched by soldiers who had never met John Garand but carried his genius in their hands. It became the backbone of training, parades, and ceremonial guards. Its shape, long, elegant, purposeful, was burned into the collective memory of war and victory. For American veterans, the Garand became an heirloom. In basements, attics, and rifle racks, it stood as a silent witness to history. Many would bring it out during reunions, tracing its stock with aged fingers. "This one's been to Normandy," one would say. "This one crossed the Rhine." The metallic ping of the clip ejecting became a symbol, a sound that meant not just firepower but survival. It was a small, almost accidental sound, but it carried the weight of empires. And across the Atlantic and Pacific, historians began to revisit the weapon's legacy. They studied the M1 not merely as a mechanical masterpiece but as a philosophical statement. In an age when dictators prized mechanized perfection, America's triumph had come from a rifle designed for the human touch, simple, efficient, and forgiving. It didn't need to be babbied or worshipped. It needed to be trusted. It reflected the men who carried it, ordinary citizens turned warriors, armed not by privilege but by resolve. The Garand didn't just fire bullets, it fired belief. In Berlin, in Tokyo, in Seoul, the rifle's legacy endured. German engineers admitted after the war that the M1 had stunned them. "We could not match its production," one noted in 1946. Its simplicity masked its brilliance. The Japanese, too, studied captured Garands, and later adapted elements of its design philosophy for their post-war weapons. Even the Soviets, though proud of their own inventions, acknowledged the Garand's influence on global arms design. It had redefined what a service rifle could be: rugged, precise, and deadly efficient. But with triumph came moral reflection. Veterans who had wielded the M1 remembered its power and its cost. For every shot that saved a comrade, another ended a life. For every beachhead secured, another was soaked in blood. The rifle had no conscience, yet it had witnessed humanity at its best and worst. Standing in museums today, polished and silent, it carries that duality like a ghost in steel. Visitors see the beauty in its craftsmanship, but veterans see the weight of what it once did. "You don't forget the sound," one said. "You don't forget what it meant." By the time the 20th century neared its close, the M1 Garand had transcended its role as a weapon. It had become legend. Its very name carried gravitas, spoken with the same reverence as Spitfire, Sherman, or Mustang. Hollywood, documentaries, and video games would immortalize it, the ping of its clip instantly recognizable to millions who had never known war. It became shorthand for courage, for grit, for the moment when America, unprepared and underestimated, rose to meet the darkest threat in history. John Garand lived long enough to see the world move past his invention, yet he never seemed bitter. When asked once if he regretted dedicating his life to something built for war, he paused. "No," he said softly. "It was made to end one." He died in 1974, buried quietly, his name etched on modest stone, but his legacy fired across time. The rifle's irony had come full circle. Once mocked as too complicated, it had outlived nearly every doubter. Once feared to jam, it had become the most reliable weapon of its generation. Once dismissed as wasteful, it had saved untold lives through its sheer efficiency. It was born in skepticism, forged in struggle, crowned in victory, and remembered in reverence. And perhaps that's the true moral of the M1 Garand story, not merely a tale of steel and genius, but of faith in progress itself. History often mocks what it doesn't understand. Innovation walks a lonely road until results silence ridicule. The same pattern repeats generation after generation. When you look at that rifle today, its walnut stock worn smooth by hands that once trembled in battle, its barrel etched faintly by time, you're not just seeing a weapon. You're seeing a turning point in civilization, a moment when humanity, standing at the edge of its own destruction, dared to build something better. They said it would jam. Didn't. They said it would waste ammo. It saved lives. They said it wouldn't change war. It changed history. And perhaps, somewhere beyond the rust and silence of old armories, the faint echo of that metallic ping still rings. A reminder that courage, once forged, never fades. So, to those who carried it, to those who built it, and to those who doubted it, this rifle story endures. The M1 Garand was more than America's weapon. It was America itself. Flawed, relentless, unstoppable. And one question still lingers for us today. When the next great invention is mocked, dismissed, and doubted by the world, will we recognize it for what it is before it changes everything once again?